Good afternoon. Today is February 2nd, 2017. My name is Melanie Egan, and I'm here at City Hall with Mr. Ivan Samuels. Together we are participating in the Newton Talks Oral History Project that is being conducted with the Newton Free Library, Historic Newton, and the Newton Senior Center. So what is your connection to Newton?
I live here. I pay taxes here. Moved to Newton in 1966. Bought a house on Park Street. Raised 4 kids. Went through all the Newton schools. Was co-president of the PTA at Underwood. My wife was president at Underwood and at Bigelow and Newton North. And I was president of the PTA Council, and then some years later my wife followed me in that role as well. So, and in the early years I was on several committees in Newton, did some things for Mayor Mann and others, and then sort of faded into the background. Okay? Well, I'm entrenched.
What were you doing before you entered the service, or what was life like for you before you entered the service?
Grew up in Brooklyn, New York. Born in 1932. Depression was then. Then World War II came about. During World War II, we used to go to Coney Island. We'd see oil slick and occasionally boxes from ships that were sunk. And as kids, we would pick up packs of cigarettes and candy and anything else that came through. Couldn't eat it if it was waterlogged, but made an impression because ships were sunk off of New York, off of Long Island. And went through school, went through high school, Stuyvesant High School in Manhattan, which is a science and math school, an exam school. Went to City College, uptown. Should have been an engineer, but got a bachelor's in psychology. But the Korean War was on, and they hadn't started draft deferment tests yet. And my friends joined Army ROTC, but I was a Boy Scout, so I knew what it was to sleep in the mud and cold, and I said I'd rather be enlisted in the Navy than an officer in the Army. So I joined the Naval Reserve and figured if I had to go on active duty as a white hat and a sailor, I'd do that. And then they started an officer program, which was 2 summers of training at that time in Long Beach, California. And I got into it. And the 2 summers of training and a bachelor's degree, got the commission and went on active duty. Spent time in Norfolk, Virginia on a command staff, and then got assigned to, after my nagging the Navy, finally went to sea. When you're single, you want to go see the world. I had shore duty. It was all right in Norfolk. Virginia Beach was close by. Got a ship, a cargo ship, home ported in Barcelona. So spent a year in and around the Mediterranean. And that was very interesting, enjoyable. We had a little bit with the Russians in trying to break up formations with ships like they're doing now with aircraft, and the Chinese are trying to do with aircraft and ships. The Russians were doing that in the Mediterranean. Decided to get out. Didn't see a career path for myself in the Navy. Stayed down south for a while in Virginia, North Carolina. Hated it. People were too slow. They moved slow. They spoke slowly. Came back to New York. I won't go into details, but I went to work at the City College in New York, and MIT had come down recruiting engineers, found me, and hired me to be director of personnel for what's now Draper Laboratory. That's what got me up here in 1957. Joined the Naval Reserve. I stayed with that. Met my wife about 2 years later, and she's a transplant. Had 3 commands, reserve commands. So it was a good career. Didn't make admiral, but made captain, same as a colonel in the Army. And made a lot of friends, Navy friends. Got active in an organization called the Navy League of the United States, which is a civilian organization which supports all of the sea services. And we sponsor the Sea Cadets, the Naval Sea Cadets, a drug-free program. And still active in that. And as I said before, I raised the kids, a boy and 3 girls. My son went to the Naval Academy, and he spent his 5 years on active duty and got out. Didn't stay in the reserve. The girls are all married, 8 grandchildren, and we're still here paying taxes. Enough? I could go on and on and on.
So how did you join, and why did you choose that specific branch?
I told you. I answered that before.
How did you adapt to military life, including the physical regimen, barracks, food, and social life?
That was a challenge because my mother always said, Ivan, how could you be so nice? And everybody says you're so nice as a kid, and you're so rotten at home. And I sort of objected to things, but you join the military, you learn to keep your mouth shut. And it wasn't easy in some ways. People said, you're Jewish. Why in the Navy? The Navy had a history of discrimination. And I said, people are they're going to accept me for what I am, for what I can do, and not for religion or what I look like or anything else. And I said, that's what I'm going to do. And I did. And it paid off because I got commands, I got promoted, and that was it. But it is a change going from civilian life. The military, you go in and the aim is to tear you down so that you're responsive to commands. And if you go into a perilous situation, whether it's the Army or the Air Force or the Navy, whatever, you have to understand that when an order is given, you have to obey it because the lives are at stake, and you can't raise your hand and say, I don't want to do that, or why are we doing that? We shouldn't be doing that. There are times when you can object to something if it's illegal and other reasons. And some of our military people have objected to things. But when you first go in, you really don't know much. And the best thing to do is keep your eyes and ears open. And they said, don't volunteer for anything, but I always volunteered for things. And I found that I got ahead because I did volunteer. And what I said before about service in Newton, things that we did go in line with them. Always had service. College, I was in a service fraternity. It was the Alpha Phi Omega, which is the Boy Scout service fraternity. We ran the blood bank and the used book exchange and the lost and found, and did ushering at freshman assemblies, all that sort of happy stuff. So, but basically, to answer your question, it's a shock.
How did you stay in touch with family and friends back home?
When I was in the States, phone calls, probably once a week, once every other week. Letters, a lot of letters, some very short. When I was aboard ship, we couldn't call. We didn't have an internet, you didn't have iPhones, and to make a telephone call, a brief telephone call from Spain to New York was like $20 for 3 minutes. I mean, who had that kind of money? So I would call every once in a while, but not regularly. It was mostly letters. And my mother took my letters and typed them out, and I have them up to a certain date. I have them in a notebook, which is interesting. Didn't realize that until we cleaned out her house after she passed away.
Do you remember arriving, and what was it like?
Arriving where?
Where you served?
Yes. My first duty assignment was in Norfolk. This was 1953. I checked in at the naval base, got assigned to a BOQ, Bachelor Officer Quarters, but I didn't have to report in to anyone until the next day. I didn't have a car, so I knew I had to go shopping for a car. And I rode the bus from the naval base into downtown Norfolk. Okay, and I shopped around. Had to take the bus back, and it was crowded, but there were seats in the back of the bus. So I went to the back of the bus, and I sat down, and then I looked around, and everybody was looking at me. They were all black. Back then, blacks sat in the back of the bus, and toilets were separate, drinking fountains were separate, and that was, I'm from Brooklyn, New York, didn't make any difference to me, but that was a learning experience. That was my first day in Norfolk. I got to like Norfolk, made a lot of friends. One of my good friends, since passed away, was scoutmaster of a Boy Scout troop, and I wanted to get involved with the community, so I became the assistant scoutmaster. Of course, Boy Scouts have older sisters, so that was one reason. And so I made friends in the community. And a lot of military people don't. They stay on the base and they do all their activities on the base, but I made friends. And then I got, finally, after putting in requests for transfer, I extended for a year, and I got the ship that I went to. But I really wanted to go to the Far East, and I wanted a combatant ship, a destroyer or a cruiser or something, and I got a cargo ship. So, but it was okay.
What are some of your most memorable experiences, positive or negative?
Positive, being treated fairly. Oh, I had one other thing that was interesting. You Northerners would appreciate. During the officer training that I mentioned, the 2 summers, my first summer was my first flight, American Airlines from New York to Los Angeles. Went aboard, we got a shoebox as we boarded the plane, and then it was our lunch. It was a sandwich, a little container of milk and an apple. First flight. Breakfast the next day, we had these metal trays, go down the chow line, and it was breakfast. And they had cereal in a container. And I said, oh, that looks like farina. So I had a dollop of that on my tray, and I added some milk and a little bit of sugar, along with the other stuff for breakfast. And the guys at the table looked at it and said, what are you doing? What are you doing? I said, well, it's farina cereal. I like it with milk and sugar. What do you mean farina cereal? Them's grits. You have grits, you put salt and pepper on them. Again, you learn. So, but what was your question?
Your most memorable experience.
That was memorable. Certainly, riding the bus was memorable. Some good things. My first assignment was in crypto communications. I got out of that quickly and got a billet that was for an engineer, and I wasn't an engineer, but I had a strong technical background, and they plugged me in so that they wouldn't lose the billet. And I did some things, a study on ships and corrosion of tankers, and the study that I came out was recommended a certain way of lining the tanks to preserve them and keep the rust particles from getting into the fuel, which could contaminate aircraft engines. And my immediate boss, a Navy commander, was favoring a different method of preserving the tanks. So I wrote this report, and he pocketed it, kept it in his desk, and never sent it ahead up to the Bureau of Naval Ships, because he favored this other method. Whether he was getting paid by somebody or what, but he favored this other thing. He got transferred, and a new commander came in to be my boss. And he said he had heard that a study was done there were about 10 of us that did different things, and we had responsibilities for different kinds of ships. I had the ammunition ships and the refrigerator ships and some of the oilers. And this commander, Frankenberger was his name, came in. He asked this question, and they pointed at me and said, well, Samuels had written something, and they didn't know what happened to the report. I keep a copy of everything I do. Went on my desk, came out with a copy, gave it to him. He forwarded right up through the commands. The admiral signed off on it and went up to the Bureau of Ships. And that's what they started. What it was you clean the tanks and you put a plastic coating, they called it saran, not like saran wrap, but a plastic coating saran, to protect the steel from the corrosive effects of aviation gasoline. So that was good, even though I was disappointed in one officer. This other officer did the right thing. He made admiral, and I sort of used him as an advisor. And when I was talking about staying in the Navy or getting out of the Navy, he gave me some very good advice. And he said, but there are a lot of divorces in the military. On the other hand, in the Navy, you're away for 6 months, and you come home for 6 months. So when you come home, it's like a second honeymoon, and by the time you get tired of each other, you're off again at sea. And somebody else said, you're away for half the year, you only fight half as much. But I was single, so it didn't make any difference. Those were interesting things. One of the reasons I got out, I really liked the Navy. I love it at sea. I'll come back to that. And aboard the ship, I had a former enlisted man who got his commission, and he was a very good seaman, and he knew ship handling, and he knew navigation and lots of other things, and I learned a lot from him. He got transferred off, and somebody else came in, relieved him, and became my boss, who I had no respect for. Nobody on the ship had respect for, because how he got assigned to the ship, I don't know, but it was a big mistake on the part of the Navy to do it. In fact, the crew at one time talked about throwing him over the side. He was that bad. The captain of the ship threw him off the bridge a couple of times because he couldn't do never. He did stupid things. And I said, you know, if the Navy sees fit to promote somebody like this and put him in a position of responsibility, I don't want it. Besides, I looked ahead, I wanted a family. I was thinking of going to graduate school. I got accepted by Cornell. I was going to go to Cornell School of Industrial Labor Relations, and decided not to, and got out, got off active duty. But I stayed in the reserve, and that was one of the best things I ever did. I was going to come back to
The sea.
what's that?
Was it the sea that you wanted to come back to?
Oh, the ocean, yeah. Here in the Boston area, I told you I was active in the Navy League and through the Reserve also. And Navy League would commission Navy ships here. In 2007, we commissioned a cruiser in Boston, the USS Sampson. She's out in the Pacific now. In 2002, we commissioned the USS Preble. She's also over there. We commissioned the Bunker Hill. We commissioned other ships. I was chairman of the commissioning committee for those last two ships that were here. This cap that I brought, that I'm wearing, this ship hasn't been commissioned yet. You know who Thomas Hudner is? You ever hear the name? Have you heard the name? Have you heard the name? What a shame. Tom Hudner is a Medal of Honor recipient from the Korean War. He flew Corsairs, and during the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, his teammate is flying another plane from the same ship, got shot down, crashed on a snowy hillside with the North Koreans and Chinese closing in. Tom Hudner lives in Concord. He's still alive. He's 92. He's got Parkinson's and a few other things, so we hope he lasts. We're planning on commissioning that ship, being built up at Bath, Maine, in the fall, late summer or fall of 2018, we hope. I'm on the commissioning committee. I'm not chairman of it. When we commissioned the Sampson, I mentioned 2007, I was asked to chair the commissioning committee. I didn't want to do it because I had been on too many other committees. And we knew the ship wasn't going to be home ported on the East Coast, so that we wouldn't be able to raise enough money to do things that we'd want to do to help the crew and help the ship. So I went online, and I remembered that during World War II, there was a Navy boot camp, training camp, just north of New York City. And I looked it up, and it wasn't there anymore. It was a state park. And I figured, well, there's a town maybe that I could link up with the ship, but there was no town. But the next line down, it said, Public School 160, Admiral Sampson Elementary School, Brooklyn, New York. Guess who went to that elementary school? What a small world. We never called it the Admiral Sampson School. I called the school, spoke to the principal. She said, oh, it was always named that way. And I said, we never did. My mother was president of the PTA. That's in the family, you know. And I checked with my brother, who passed away 2 weeks ago. He was 5 years older. And he never heard it called the Sampson School. My sister, 8 years younger, never heard it called the Sampson School. But the school was named back in the early 1900s, this was in 1902, 1903, they were naming schools after military heroes. I went to the John J. Pershing Junior High School. You know who General Pershing was? You know who General Pershing was? General Pershing, World War I. Okay. So it had the name. So we went down to visit a female officer, an ensign, and an enlisted petty officer, and I visited the school, went down to Brooklyn. All Chinese or Vietnamese or whatever, and the other half of the school was of Hispanic derivation. A lot different from when I went there. You can't go home again. You'll find as you get older and you go back to school, if the school still exists, the corridors are not as big as you thought they were. The rooms, principal's office, which I remembered greatly from when I was in elementary school. I spent a lot of time there. I told you, I rebelled. Let's face it. Yeah, so, but coming back to it, I love the sea. So every time I could go to sea, I would go to sea. As a reservist, I would always get a ship. We got smaller vessels, minesweepers, etc. And I would cruise and go down the Caribbean in February. We go to San Juan and St. Thomas, and also later in destroyers, and come back, and my wife has to shovel the snow out while we were gone. And when I got too senior to go aboard Navy ships, because I couldn't be senior to the commanding officer, makes it awkward. When you're retired, it's okay, but if you're still in the reserve, you still have some responsibility and authority. But I got to be too senior. So then when I was on commissioning committees, I would go down to Norfolk or to Newport, if there were going to be Newport, and ride the ship back up to Boston, so I'd be at sea overnight. The John F. Kennedy, the aircraft carrier, that's now gone, I rode her twice from Norfolk up to Boston. The last time she was up here, I rode her, and it was a shame because they were tearing it down by that time, reducing the crew. But I love it at sea. I still do.
What was it like to return to civilian life?
Easy. Nobody told me what to do. Yes. That was easy. I had no trouble. The biggest problem was getting a job. I stayed in Norfolk because this friend of mine who was Boy Scout leader, he was working for a company, so I went with him, and I wound up doing some work for that company, opened up an office in Petersburg, Virginia, which is about 20 miles south of Richmond. And then they transferred me down to Greensboro, North Carolina, which wasn't bad because it's a beautiful area down there. Greensboro, Golden Triangle, if you ever get to North Carolina. At that time, it was the Women's College of the University of North Carolina. It's now co-ed, but that was great. And but as I said earlier, I hated it down south. I just couldn't stay there. So I packed up, came back to New York, and then 6 months later came to Boston, 1957, and stayed. But it was easy. I was civilian at heart. The military wasn't ingrained in me.
How did your service and experiences affect your life and your outlook on war and the military in general?
The reserve more than the active duty, because it gave me command authority. It gave me more responsibility and had to look out for more people than my own immediate circle. I think I was always, looking at society, etc., I think I was always somewhat of a fiscal conservative and a moderate social type, and still am. But I don't think the military, I don't know, I just grew that way. I had my own business. I worked for three MIT and then two electronics or defense companies. They did other science companies, and then went off and got into the executive search business, and then became a partner and then owner. And that's what put bread on the table all the years until I closed the business. But I got along with everybody. I made some enemies along the way, but I try to get along with people. I don't know if that answered your question.
What would you like people to know 100 years from now?
About me or in general?
Just in general.
100 years from now. Interesting. History. I would like people to know history and learn from history what we did wrong and what we did right. And people today don't really know. Like, there are a lot of things you don't know that went on. You don't know what it was like to live in the Depression. Where did food come from? Or during World War II, I remember stamps. You had to have stamps to buy things, red stamps and blue stamps and whatever, and gasoline was rationed. And we in the United States were very fortunate, but people in Europe and other parts of the world were not as fortunate as we were. The shortages of food. We said, okay, there were shortages of gasoline, or there were shortages of meat, or you heard that the A&P got a shipment in of canned tuna fish. So you rush down with your stamp books and were able to buy whatever cans of tuna fish. Word got around. You think about other countries where they do that just to get a loaf of bread. So I'd say history is the most important thing, and learn from it.
Is there anything else you'd like to add? Any other memories or experiences?
I could talk all day. I think people should be respectful of other people's opinions, and whether they agree or disagree, be respectful of them. I'm so disappointed at the riots that we've been having and the displays that we've been having. Regarding the last election, for better or for worse, we have a president. If he does wrong, he'll get impeached. I think he's getting a lot of noise now about things. But people who you would have assumed would have taken it in stride, people who were on the losing side of the election, the reaction was, I did not expect the reaction that was there. Disappointment, yes, but people saying, I'm going to move to Canada, and then they never did, or going to resign from the United States. You take it, you live with it, you make the changes, do what you can in the next go-around. You want change, then you try to make change and work from within. I would like to see people be able to spend more time doing volunteer work, whatever it is the heart leads them to, whether it's to help out in a nursing home or to help out in the streets or whatever, or make contributions or work in an organization that does good things. And we don't see that anymore, not a lot of it. Every organization is struggling to get volunteers in. I mean, here, I talked about the Navy League. At one time, we were 76,000 members, and we're now down to 40,000. All organizations, and it could be a Red Cross chapter, it could be anything. The volunteers aren't there to do things that we did years ago. I mean, a lot of you remember from some time back. Think about it today. Where are the volunteers? And then you look at the politicians, and for the most part, politicians at the national level, they're lawyers. They never earned a living in their lives. They never worked for a living. They're lawyers. And I think that's the bottom line. I can close with that.
Okay. So it looks like our time is just about up. Thank you so much for taking time to do this with us. We're really happy to be able to include you in the Newton Talks Oral History Project.
I hope I didn't talk too much.